So this lesson, we're going to be looking at how we can hold values variable, the rules for naming variables, how we can change to different data types, such as strings, numbers, booleans, objects, undefined, how we can declare multiple variables together using the comma, and the differences between let and const when you are writing your code and declaring variables. The previous lesson, we had an alert. There's also a prompt that you can use, and this allows you to ask a question. So in this case, we're going to have the question, how are you, being asked whenever the web page loads. We get an input area, and that provides the user a way to interact with your web page content. Once we click OK, then the web page will continue to execute. But we didn't actually capture the response back from the user. So if we want to capture the user's response, we can do that within the prompt, and that allows us to make use of that response that's coming specifically from the user and use that within the code. So let's go ahead and we're going to set up a variable. And what a variable does is it creates a container that allows us to store values. There's different ways to declare variables. You can either use let or const. The difference between let is that you can update the variable, and const won't allow you to update the value of the variable. So give the variable a name. I'm going to call it val, and this is going to be returning back the response back from the how are you. And you can see that when we use the how are you in the console and we type that information, we can add the message back from the user and we get the response back of great. So what's going to happen now within the code, just as we saw within the console, this response back will be then captured within the variable of val, and when we want to reference whatever that value is within the response, we can then use it and refer to it within the console using the value of val. So let's go ahead and we're going to type in great, hit OK, and now we see within the console we're logging out the value of great. So at any time we can then select the response back value and then interact with it and make use of it within the code, just as we did within the console where we're outputting the value of val within the console itself. And we're going to set a value for val, and this is just going to be a string value, and the same as what we saw being returned back from the prompt, it will be a value of great. So whenever we want to reference the value that's contained in there, we can just use the value of val. So if we have a user and that user has a first name, that gives us a way to reference the first name, and then also the last name using variables. And now whenever we want to select the first and the last name, we can just reference the variables that contain those values. With variables as well and string variables, we can join them together within the same output. So if we want to output the first name, we could reference it using the variable of first, and then also add it together with the output of the variable of last. So that outputs the first name and the last name together within the console. Notice that we don't have any spacing in there, so we can also add in a space as another string value and then join them together, or we can reference the space character, and that can just be another string value, and whenever we want to use the space character, then we can just reference it using its variable name, and that will provide the same output within the spacing that we see within the console. And the nice thing about variables is you can use them and reuse them within the code. So if we only wanted the last name, we could just reference the last name. So for this instance, line number 7, we want the first and the last name. In the line number 8, we only want the last name. So then we reference the variable that contains that information. And also variables are designed to change. So if we did set it as let, declare it as let, we can reassign a new value. So if our first name happens to change within the code and we've got a new first name, let's update the first name And now the first name is different. When we used the code, it still was Laurence Svekis, but when we try to use it again, now that we've got an updated value for the value of first, and the last and the space character are still going to be the same, we're going to get the new output being output into the console. If we set a variable and we declare it as const, so I'm going to create a variable, and if we had something like a counter, so setting it up to start at 0, and when you are using different data types, so far we've been using the string, and for strings we need to either single or double quote around a string. For using a number or an integer, you can just select it as a numeric value, and that's not going to have any quotes around it. So if we want to reference the value of counter, we can do that as well, where we're outputting counter into the console. But if we do try to assign a new value to counter, we're going to throw an error, because here we've declared the variable using const, and that's going to lead to this error that we're not able to reassign a new value to const. If we did have it as let, it would allow us to reassign a new value. So this is a way that you can provide a fail-safe that if you have a value that you don't want to change and don't intend to change within the code, this prevents you from accidentally changing that value. So in this case, we didn't change last, so let's keep the last name as Svekis, and we don't want to change it within the code, so this prevents us from accidentally changing it. If we have a lot of code, we might not necessarily notice that we don't want to change this and try to change it, and now it's going to throw an error if we do try to change it. So setting up the code structure and how you want to write the code is an important part of planning the code as you're laying it out. With the declaring of the variables, that you should declare the variable using const if you don't want to change the value, and if you do want to change the value, then you use let in order to declare the variable value. So variables allow you to hold values, and they can be updated only with let if needed. Typically, you do declare the variables at the start of when you're writing your JavaScript file, so that they're up at the top, and then within the code, this is where you would be updating them and changing the values. You are declaring variables, you can comma separate in order to declare multiple variables, and you don't actually need to assign any values to a variable if you're declaring them. If you try to use a variable that has not been declared, you're going to see that that's going to throw an error. So we don't have a value for E, but we do have values for A, B, C, and D. So if we were to try to output a value of A, and notice we haven't assigned any values to it, it's going to be returned back as undefined. And that's the default value when you do declare a variable but you haven't assigned a value to it. Using the equal sign, the default of the variable is just going to be undefined. When it comes to naming variables, commonly if we do have a value that we're expecting to make it more readable, we will declare it using camel case. So instead of writing full name, where we'd have the value of first plus the space character plus last, and if we console log out the value of full name, this is going to be the value of all of those together, just as we're outputting it into the console, but now it's going to be contained and assigned to this variable value. So if we were to actually change full name, where we're changing the value of first, that initial full name is going to take those values before the change was made. So again, going through the sequence of the code as it gets executed, when it encounters full name, these values hold the above values that were output into the console, and this is what gets assigned to full name. So full name now is going to have a string value, and then once we make the change, full name is still going to remain the same because it's not referencing the variables, it's got a value that's being returned back that's assigned to it. And that's why when we use full name, we can output it within the console. Another way to make naming and making the code more readable is to use what's known as the camel case. So that's uppercase for the second word, and this makes it more readable that this is actually going to be two separate words, as we can't use spaces in the variable names. So if we were to try to add in a space, it would immediately throw an error because it's not able to identify that this is going to be one variable name. It's going to see the variable name as full and then the space, and it doesn't know what to make from the name value. So don't include any spaces when you are naming your variables. And when you are giving your variables a name, make sure that the names are unique, as if you try to use the same name again. So if the names are not unique, then you're going to just be reassigning new values to them. Also, the variable names should be meaningful and semantic, such as we're using full name. So that's going to be referencing the full name, whereas first and last are just the first and last name. You can also only start the variable using a letter, a $, or an underscore. And those are the only three characters. You can't start it out with a number, as it's going to throw an error. You can use numbers within the variable name, so you can use digits. You can also use $scores and underscores within the variable name. So these are all valid ways to create the variable name. So it can be a $, underscore, or a character that will start the variable name. And then within the variable, you can use those same characters as well as numbers in order to define the variable. Variables are also case sensitive. So if we have a variable that has a case of lowercase, that's going to be different than a variable that has different case letters. So when we look at first and first, if we're uppercasing that, that's going to be referencing a different variable that's going to be held and identified with this variable name. So this is something that you also want to try to avoid, where you're using the same variable name but the case is different. So names can also not be reserved words, so you can't do a let const, as this will throw an error, as let and const are both reserved names. There's also no spaces that are allowed within the names. So if you do throw a space in the name, it's going to throw an error, as that's not going to be allowed within the naming of the variable either. There are different data types, and JavaScript will automatically do a type conversion to find out what data type your variable is. You can use the type of method. So try that again within the console, where we're going to get the type of using the type of method, and then we need to reference the variable that we want to look at. So check to see what full name is being returned back. So this is being returned back as a string. We'll also do a type of for the counter, as we set this up to be a number, and see what gets returned back, that this is a data type of number. If you do take a variable, and if we do assign a string value to it, and the string is going to be indicated with the quotes, JavaScript is automatically going to convert to the different data types. So now they're both going to be strings, and counter becomes a string type. There's also Boolean values. So Boolean values can either be true or false, and we'll look at those in more detail later on. They as well don't have any quotes around them, so that just returns back as a Boolean, so either true or false, and that's going to get the boo value. So the Boolean value is going to be returned back. So we've got a string, we've got a number, and we also have a Boolean as the different data types. You can also set values to null. So if we had a value, we can set it to null. We can also set a value to undefined. Although we can do this, this is not good practice, as we want to try to avoid setting it to undefined, because undefined is the default for a variable that hasn't been declared. And when you are debugging your code, you do want to see that if a value has been set to null, then that value variable has had a value assigned to it, whereas undefined would not have had a value assigned to it. So that would be the same thing as if we were just declaring the variable, and that's going to be returned back as undefined. So go ahead and try it out. Create some variables and then output them into the console. Also check the different types of your variables that are using, and you can be ready to move on to the next lesson.